All or nothing. Most differences that matter in real life are differences of degree, even when these are extreme differences, such as that between an undernourished peasant owning only the rags on his back and a Maharaja bedecked in gold and living in one of his several palaces. Yet a polemical tactic has developed which enables virtually any general statement, however true, to be flatly denied, simply because it is not 100% true in all circumstances. The simplest and most obvious statement, that the sky is blue, for example, can be denied using this tactic because the sky is not always blue. It is reddish at sunset, black at midnight, and gray on an overcast day. Thus, it is simplistic to say that the sky is blue. By the same token, it is simplistic to say that the ocean is water, because there are all sorts of minerals dissolved in the ocean, which also contains fish, plant life, and submarines, among other things. This trivializing tactic is widely but selectively used to deny whatever needs denying, however true it may be. Even in the days of Stalin, to make a distinction between the communist world and the free world was to invite sarcastic dismissals of this distinction, based upon particular inadequacies, injustices, or restrictions found in the so-called free world, as the intelligentsia often characterized it, which kept it from being 100% free, democratic, and just. This tactic persisted throughout a whole era, during which millions of human beings in Europe and Asia fled the lands of their birth, often leaving behind their worldly belongings and severing the personal ties of a lifetime, sometimes taking desperate chances with their own lives and the lives of their children, all in order to try to reach the so-called free world. This verbal tactic continued, even as some communist nations themselves chose to undergo political convulsions and economic chaos in order to try to become more like the so-called free world. All-or-nothing reasoning allows the anointed to say that such things as crime, child abuse, and alcoholism occur in all classes, that all segments of society are susceptible to AIDS, and otherwise obfuscate the very large and very consequential differences in all these areas. All-or-nothing rhetoric has likewise served as a substitute for arguments in many other contexts. Attempts to resist the escalating politicization of courts, colleges, and other institutions have been met with similarly derisive dismissals, on grounds that these institutions are already political, so that it is hypocritical to protest their politicization now, merely because of the ascendancy of political ideas with which one disagrees. This all-or-nothing argument has become a standard response to any resistance to the escalating politicization of any institution or organization. Obviously, if there is not complete anarchy, there must be some political structure, and the institutions within the society must in some way be linked to those structures, if only by obeying the laws of the land. No institution in any society can possibly be non-political in the ultimate sense of being hermetically sealed off from governmental authority. Yet centuries of struggle and bloodshed have gone into the effort to create zones of autonomy, constitutional limitations on government, and institutional traditions, all in order to insulate individuals and organizations from the full impact of political activity and governmental power. The separation of church and state, the sanctity of the doctor-patient relationship, the lifetime appointments of federal judges, and the exemption of spouses from testifying against one another in court are just some of the examples of these attempts to provide insulation from governmental power and the political process. Nevertheless, all-or-nothing rhetoric has been used to deny that any institution is non-political, thereby justifying such things as turning classrooms into propaganda centers, and judges disregarding the written law in order to substitute their own social theories as a basis for judicial rulings. At the very least, one might debate the specific merits or consequences of such actions, rather than have the whole issue preempted by the trivializing argument that educational institutions or courts are already political, in some sense or other. Extreme differences of degree are commonly understood as differences in kind, as when we refer to a Maharaja as rich and a hungry peasant as poor, even though each owns something and neither owns everything. A special variant of the all-or-nothing approach is what might be called tactical agnosticism. Law professor Ronald Dworkin, for example, objected to application of laws against inciting to riot because we have no firm understanding of the process by which demonstration disintegrates into riot. Apparently, society must remain paralyzed until it has definitive proof, which of course no one has with most decisions, personal or social. All-or-nothing tactics are almost infinitely adaptable as substitutes for arguments and evidence on a wide range of issues. For example, any policy proposals to which the anointed object can be dismissed as no panacea. Since nothing is a panacea, the characterization is always correct, regardless of the merits or demerits of the policy or its alternatives. This categorical phrase simply substitutes for logic or evidence as to those merits or demerits. Conversely, when a policy promoted by the anointed turns out to create more problems than it solves, if it solves any, attempts to show how the previous situation was far better are almost certain to be dismissed on grounds that opponents are nostalgic for a golden age which never existed in reality. Golden ages being as rare as panaceas, this truism again serves to preempt any substantive argument about the merits or demerits of alternative policies. The all-or-nothing fallacy is also used to deal with analogies used for or against the vision of the anointed. Because all things are different, except for the similarities, and are the same, except for the differences, any analogy, however apt, can be rejected by those who find it a sufficient objection that the things being analogized are not really the same. By the same token, any analogies favored, however strained, can be defended on grounds that those things analogized involve the same underlying or essential principle. Ice and steam are chemically the same thing, though of course they are not physically the same thing. Just as it is possible to make or deny an analogy between ice and steam, so any other analogy can be selectively made or denied. Similarly, anything can be said to have worked, as Lincoln Steffens said somewhat prematurely of the Soviet Union, or to have failed, as critics said of the Reagan administration's policies, because everything works by sufficiently low standards, and everything fails by sufficiently high standards. Such statements are not arguments, they are tactics in lieu of arguments, and they are accepted only insofar as they are consonant with the prevailing vision. A special variant of the all-or-nothing principle is the view that either one knows exactly what particular statements mean, or else one is free to engage in adventurous reinterpretations of the words. In literature, this is called deconstruction, and in the law, it is called judicial activism. Proponents of judicial activism, for example, make much of the fact that the Constitution of the United States in some places lacks precision or is not exact. Ultimately, nothing is exact, not even physical measurements, for the instruments themselves cannot be made 100% accurate. In the real world, however, this theoretical difficulty is resolved in practice by establishing tolerance limits, which vary with the purpose at hand. A precision optical instrument that is off by half an inch may be wholly unusable, while a nuclear missile that lands 5 miles off the target has virtually the same effect as if it had landed directly in the center of the target. However, in the vision of the anointed, the absence of precision becomes an authorization for substituting the imagination. In reality, however, the question is not what exactly the Constitution meant by cruel and unusual punishment, but whether the death penalty, for example, was included or excluded. Precision is a red herring. All-or-nothing arguments are not mere intellectual errors. They are tactics which free the anointed from the constraints of opposing arguments, discordant evidence, or, in the case of judicial activism, from the constraints of the Constitution. Most important of all, they are freed from the feedback of uncooperative reality. Innocuous generalities. Yet another technique for arguing without actually using any arguments is to bury the specifics of one's policy preferences in a vast generality, so diffuse that no one can effectively oppose it. For example, many people say that they are for change, either implying or stating that those opposed to the specific changes they advocate are against change as such, yet virtually no one is against generic change. The staunchest conservatives advocate a range of changes which differ in specifics, rather than in number or magnitude, from the changes advocated by those considered liberal or radical. Milton Friedman wrote a book entitled The Tyranny of the Status Quo, and the policy changes of the 1980s have been called the Reagan Revolution. Edmund Burke, the patron saint of conservatism, said, "A state without the means of change is without the means of its conservation." Change, as such, is simply not a controversial issue, yet a common practice among the anointed is to declare themselves emphatically piously and defiantly in favor of change. Thus, those who oppose their particular changes are depicted as being against change in general. It is as if opponents of the equation 2 plus 2 equals 7 were depicted as being against mathematics. Such a tactic might, however, be more politically effective than trying to defend the equation on its own merits. Change encompasses everything from genocide to the Second Coming. To limit the term to beneficial change, to progress, is to be no more specific. Quite aside from whether the result anticipated will actually follow from the policies advocated, there are often serious differences of opinion as to whether a given empirical result is in fact morally or socially desirable. Everyone is for a beneficial outcome, they simply define it in radically different terms. Everyone is a progressive by his own lights. That the anointed believe that this label differentiates themselves from other people is one of a number of symptoms of their naive narcissism. In academic circles, the equally vast generality is diversity, which often stands for a quite narrow social agenda, as if those who reiterate the word diversity endlessly had no idea that diversity is itself diverse and has many dimensions besides the one with which they are preoccupied. Advocates of diversity in a race or gender sense are often quite hostile to ideological diversity when it includes traditional or conservative values and beliefs. Innovative is another of the generalities used in place of arguments, and making a difference is likewise promoted as something desirable, without any specific arguments. However, the Holocaust was innovative, and Hitler made a difference. The anointed, of course, mean that their particular innovations will be beneficial, and that the differences their policies make will be improvements. But that is precisely what needs to be argued, instead of evading the responsibility of producing evidence or logic by resorting to preemptive words. The shifting viewpoint. Often, discussions of political controversies begin in the conventional forms of an argument, examining opposing assumptions, reasons, logic, or evidence, and then shift suddenly to presenting the opaque conclusions of one side. This tactic is yet another way for the anointed to appear to argue, without the responsibility of actually producing or defending any arguments. During the student riots of the 1960s, for example, columnist Tom Wicker's reply to those who charged that reason and civility were being violated on university campuses was, all too often, as today's students see things, reason and civility merely cloak hypocrisy and cynicism, and they aim to strike through the mask. As regards the student seizure of a building at Harvard, Wicker said, "Who really abandoned reason and civility?" students asked. The students who seized a building to protest the Harvard Corporation's retention of ROTC, or the administrators who called in police to evict the protesters with what was widely regarded as excessive violence. This verbal sleight of hand not only enabled Wicker to put forth justifications without having to justify, but also to transform a vocal and violent minority into spokesmen for students in general. Students everywhere volubly hold to the belief that an establishment, political, social, economic, military, manipulates society for its own ends, so that the popular rule of the people is a myth. The war goes on, racism continues, poverty remains, despite the familiar American preachments of peace, democracy, prosperity, and the rule of reason. If Wicker had said on his own that the failure of American society, like every other society on earth, to solve all its problems was justification for violence, he would have been expected to produce some logic or evidence of his own. Instead, he was able to shift to the viewpoint of students everywhere and to characterize them as idealistic youth. In general, to say that it appears to some observers that this or that is true is meaningless as a justification, because there would obviously be no issue in the first place unless some other observers saw things differently. Illegitimate as it is to evade the responsibility for one's conclusions by shifting to someone else's viewpoint, it is doubly illegitimate when that is merely a presumed viewpoint, contradicted by what the others you are relying on actually said. In the wake of the Los Angeles riots of 1992, for example, many of the anointed justified the violence and destruction by shifting to the presumed viewpoint of the black community, when in fact 58% of blacks polled characterized the riots as totally unjustified. Justifying criminal activity by shifting to the presumed viewpoint of others extends far more widely in time and space. Ramsey Clark, for example, declared, Nothing so vindicates the unlawful conduct of a poor man, by his light, as the belief that the rich are stealing from him through overpricing and sales of defective goods. Not a speck of evidence was presented to show that the typical poor person in fact saw things this way by his light, or by the light of Ramsay Clark, for that matter. Even in scholarly, or at least academic, studies, the shifting viewpoint has substituted for both logic and evidence. For example, historian David Breon Davis said, Emerson recognized the economic motive in British emancipation of slaves in its empire, thus relieving himself of the formidable task of substantiating this conclusion in the teeth of massive evidence to the contrary. Words like recognized or admitted, attached to selected quotations, shift both the viewpoint and the burden of proof. Often a shifting to the individual, in an issue that reaches far beyond that individual, takes the more specific form of what logicians call the fallacy of composition, the assumption that what applies to a part applies also to the whole. For example, it is true that one person in a stadium crowd can see the game better if he stands up, but it is not true that if they all stand up, everyone will see better. Those who focus on the effects of any particular government policy or judicial ruling on particular individuals or groups often implicitly commit the fallacy of composition, for the whole point of government policies and judicial rulings is that they apply very broadly to many people, and what happens as a consequence to those who are ignored is no less important than what happens to those who have been arbitrarily singled out by an observer. New York Times columnist Anna Quindlen, for example, responded to criticisms of disruptions by gay activists demanding more money for AIDS by saying, "If I could help give someone I loved a second chance, or even an extra year of life, what people think would not worry me a bit." In other words, the desires of the arbitrarily selected group are made the touchstone, not the consequences of such behavior on other people whose money is to be commandeered for their benefit, or the consequences for society in making mob rule the mode of social decision-making. In a similar vein, Quindlen referred to letters from other readers on other issues, saying, "Thank you for speaking our truth." However lofty and vaguely poetic such words may seem, the cold fact is that the truth cannot become private property without losing its whole meaning. Truth is honored precisely for its value in interpersonal communication. If we each have our own private truths, then we would be better off, as well as more honest, to stop using the word or the concept and recognize that nobody's words could be relied upon anymore. The more subtle insinuation is that we should become more sensitive to some particular group's truth, that is, that we should arbitrarily single out some group for different standards, according to the fashions of the times or the vision of the anointed.